that I want to read, it's actually chapter 4, and to kind of frame it, so it will make sense to let you know that my mother and I, we've gotten kicked out of the village somewhere around Incheon for her having a black kid, me. And during that existence, I spent a lot of time trying to kind of get into the world of all of the other little kids who wouldn't let me play along with them. So I kind of sat on the side and kind of practiced my games, waiting for my opportunity to kind of prove my worth as a little boy. So after my mother and I, we get kicked out of the village, we moved to Dongducheon, near the DMZ. And I believe that's where she's probably from, because goes to find out my grandparents live in the mountains of Dongducheon. And the beginning part of this chapter, which I won't read, starts off with me finally involved in, my first kind of team thing, or first kind of level of acceptance as a child, as a 5-year-old that I ever had, because I was in a Taekwondo class, and I was very, very eager to kind of again show my worth. And that particular day, I had just tested for my yellow belt, and I'm going to start at that point. I ran home, ignoring the strings of my unlaced shoes as they thrashed around my ankles. The pedestrians probably thought I'd stolen something, but this time I didn't care. I ran with a smile and excitement in my stride, giddy to tell Oma the news. I burst through the front door, stumbling out of my mud-caked shoes and screaming for her attention. "Oma, I did it!" She was in the kitchen with her back to me. She didn't respond the way that I thought she would, as dinner simmered in the nearby pot. She clenched papers as she wept. I ran to her side to see what was wrong. She turned, wiping away tears, and reached for my embrace. Still in my coat, I tossed aside my belt and hugged her tight with concerned eyes wide open. "What's wrong, Oma?" I asked. "I've received some news from your grandparents," she said, sniffing quietly, trying to regain her composure. "It looks like you're going to finally meet them this weekend, along with one of your older sisters." "Sisters? I have Nunas?" That notion that I had grandparents and sisters was as foreign and distant as my mysterious black father in the magical land of America. Of course I'd seen older people, but I never knew that children had children and so on. Hell, I was 5. All I knew was that I had my mother, and she was all the family that I'd ever need. The following Saturday, we prepared for our trip up to the mountains as frigid temperatures and a fresh blanket of snow awaited. The usual humming and the smiles of my mother's early morning movements were non-existent that day. Pensive and quiet, she wiped, swept, packed a bag, whispering to herself. Moments later, she ushered me out to a waiting taxi in my heavy coat as I clutched my wooden train. After almost an hour, on a slow road up the mountain, we pulled into a clearing that opened to a beautiful traditional house, or hanok. The driver stopped at granite steps, which led to the front door. My mother instructed him to wait for an hour as he responded by removing his white cotton gloves, popping out a box of his cigarettes, and reclining in his seat with a newspaper. My mother grabbed my hand and led me up the steps. She paused and took a deep breath before lifting the brass ring knocker. A quiet woman appeared, almost hiding behind the door, eyes fixed on the ground, never looking at me. She whispered for us to enter. We removed our coats and shoes in the dark foyer as the old woman quietly closed the door behind us. Small, quiet, but strong, she seemed to be in her 70s, but stood with purpose. She rustled with every step in her sandals and silky pants as we followed her down the dark wooden hallway. She must be the maid, I thought, as we followed. We arrived at a room with sliding doors the woman opened with both hands. She slid aside, dropping her head and as she directed us in. Austere and clean, the large room featured a low-slung table full of panchan. Sitting in lotus position at the head was a tanned elder man with striking gray hair, looking hardened and experienced. He must be my halabaji, I thought. Just then, the old woman shuffled by and sat next to the table on her knees, dutifully completing the final preparations for the meal. Where is my grandmother? I wondered as I looked around. Still holding my hand, my mother walked to the table and sat to the left of the old man, opposite of the woman, and still not a word had been spoken. Gazing stoically at me, the man turned to my mother and asked, "So, how was your trip?" "It was slow but fine. Milton and I slept most of the way," my mother said as she patted my shoulders as I inched closer to her side. "How are the both of you?" my mother asked the old man. "Our health is good, and that's all we can ask for," he said as he leaned toward the woman's direction. In response, she turned from the table and offered a slow and deep bow. "She must be my harmony," I screamed in my head, almost verbalizing my thoughts in complete shock. Just then, a young woman who looked no more than 20 years old walked into the room. Tall and slim, with straight black hair and a tan wide face like my mother's, sat opposite to my grandfather and nodded to my mother. "Annyeonghaseyo, Oma," she said with a respectful bow. "Milton, meet your grandparents and your sister, Pak Young-soo," Oma said with a proud smile and a sweeping wave of her arm. I didn't know what to do. These people were family. They were blood, but I knew that they didn't want me, as if I was contagious. So I stayed close to my mother's hip, taking in the scene. I wouldn't find out for another 35 years that I not only had this sister, but also two others. My sisters were full Korean, born in 55, 56, and 65. The sister that I met that day was either my eldest or my second to the eldest. I was told that she was studying at a university in Seoul. Even though that they were family, the deep seeds of racism and Korean pride were apparently too deep to allow them to love their black grandson and their brother. My grandmother placed a bubbling pot of soup on a burner in the middle of our table. We quietly filled our bowls and ate in a chorus of slurps and clinking utensils. Heads were deep in our meals when my grandfather broke the silence with a deep sigh. "So, young Ja, have you made a decision?" The abruptness of the question froze the room. Chewing paused, chopsticks suspended over bowls while anxious eyes reluctantly fixed on my mother. Oma calmly laid her spoon down and wiped her mouth. She laid both palms on the table and steadied herself. "Yes, Appa, I have," she said. She paused and looked around, soliciting eye contact. "I appreciate the invitation to see you two after all these years. We haven't been the best at expressing how we really feel about our situation, have we?" She said with a tilt of her head. "Our relationship hasn't been ideal, but I do understand." They sat quietly, only letting their solemn faces provide them voice. My sister and grandmother stared at the table while my grandfather looked intently into my mother's eyes as she continued. "I have made some decisions in life that have not only affected me, but all of you as well. Whether it be my education, my career choices, or personal affairs, I never did anything to deliberately hurt any of you. I hope you know that. But yes, I have made some mistakes, and I'm reminded of those mistakes every day of my life. And yes, I do have regrets." She paused and looked at me with tenderness as I peered into her eyes, looking for understanding. She briskly rubbed my hair and with a smile and continued. "But Milton is not one of those mistakes." Icy faces glared at my mother as she continued. "For all the years that I've been your daughter," she said in a voice full of respect and resolve, "you've done a wonderful job to help me feel less than that. You've helped turn my own daughters against me and never supported me in the times of need. I've grown accustomed to living my life as an island. But I have a wonderful son, my little man, my little Milton. And I don't think that time will be kind enough to change my life in a manner that will satisfy either of you. So I have to refuse your conditional offer of support. I will not bargain with him, for he's forever mine." As tears swelled in her eyes, she continued. "So this might possibly be the last meal we share together. But I have made up my mind, and I will have to live my own life, for I have chosen my own path. Kamsamnida, Oma, Appa. It was a gracious meal, but we must be going." As she wiped away tears, she nudged me. "Kaja, Milton, our taxi is waiting." I jumped to my feet, trotted to the door, and eagerly slid it open for my mother. "Goodbye, Oma, Appa," my mother said before turning to her daughter. "And young Sue, you have my address. Let me know when you'd like to come and visit." "I will, Oma," Young-Soo managed, her puckered lips and wide slanted eyes shaking from emotion. My grandmother kept her gaze low to the table while grandfather pressed his lips in defiance. Oma stood and brushed herself off and walked towards me as I eagerly waited. I saw a smile form on her face, growing brighter with every step, like sun shining through a storm. "Pak Young Ja!" grandmother yelled, again freezing the room. "You are not a child." Her glare never left the table as she spoke with words held within for far too long. "We have patiently lived this burden with you that you have forced upon us, and now we want to live what's left of our lives in peace." The demure old woman now screamed with surprising strength as her shaking fist bore into the table, causing her tan, freckled knuckles to grow pale. "You need to understand that there are no more chances beyond that door," she screamed with conviction. My mother turned her head, barely looking over her shoulders, and said calmly, "I do understand, Oma." She quickly ushered me out of the doorway, and we hurried down the hallway and jumped into our shoes. I almost lost my breath in our haste and excitement to leave the unwelcome place. I wanted to tell those old folks how I really felt. We didn't want your food, your house, your attention. We had everything that we could ever need, each other. Blood or not, just like the villagers, good riddance, I thought. In the haze of cigarette smoke, the driver sprung to life from underneath his newspaper as the front door slammed with a heavy thud behind us. Adjusting his mesh cap, he revved the idling engine as we jumped into the taxi, giddy from excitement as if we had stolen something and gotten away with it. For the entire ride, she stared into the woods in silence as the snow-covered pine trees passed by. She held me tight by her side as if she'd never let me go. My story has the backdrop of adoption and identity and all that sort of stuff, but it really, if you kind of boil it down, it gives you my blueprint for healing. So, my life is lots of kind of everything, kind of good and bad. From the adoption thing to to me being hammered at, having hangovers at 6 years old, to being in Cook County Jail when I'm 23 years old and being kicked out of multiple universities and all that stuff, but I keep it moving because I'm able to, and I think the thrust of how I'm able to is because, it's like I own everything I am, and I try to provide a kind of a blueprint for anyone, because we all got trauma. We all been through shit. But I think there's a conversation that you can have with yourself to help you deal with that and to own it so you can ultimately, love yourself. And that is, I think, my purpose of the book.